Recording in progress.
And now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce the panel host, Simon Buckingham Shum. Simon is Professor of Learning Analytics and Director of the Connected Intelligence Center in the University of Technology, Sydney, where his team researchers deploy and evaluate learning analytics and AI-enabled edtech tools. He has helped to develop learning analytics as an academic field for the last decade and has served 2 terms as SOLAR Vice President. His background in ergonomics and human-computer interaction always draws his attention to how the human and technical must be co-designed to work together to create sustainable work practices. He recently coordinated the UDS EdTech Ethics Deliberative Democracy Consultation, in which online exam proctoring was an example examined by students and staff. Simon, the floor is yours.
Very much, Isabel. Thank you to SOLAR for hosting this important conversation. Before going any further, I just want to acknowledge that the University of Technology Sydney is located on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of knowledge on this land. And I'd like to pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous people who are with us today. And if you know whose lands you are on at the moment, then do put them into the chat so we can see the rich diversity. Well, today we're going to talk about one of the most complex forms of AI that has been introduced into higher education and at great speed. That raises lots of issues. Last year, my daughter was sitting her final examinations under lockdown. She was informed that she would have to install special software, which would give control of her camera, mic, and entire laptop to the remote invigilator. She watched while the remote admin connected to her laptop and changed a whole load of settings. By the way, with no support afterwards to reset those settings. Note, she had to show the person watching her live, her bedroom and walls to prove that her room was empty and that she had no notes on the walls. She also had to avoid a list of behaviors when she had an AI invigilator watching to avoid triggering cheating alerts. And she was particularly worried about her tendency to sort of look up when she was visualizing and thinking about ideas in case that was illegal. Millions of students around the world did this in order to sit their exams and get their degrees that they worked so hard for. And this, in an emergency, was the best solution, it would seem. It was strange, like any new technology. It was stressful, and even more so, of course, for students grappling with emotional, physical, social, or technical challenges. We also know that most universities went to great lengths to make alternative arrangements for students who could not do this for whatever reason. But obviously, under lockdown, capacity to bring students on campus was limited. So what do we make of all this? Clearly, it's a victory for EdTech, right? I mean, we have just witnessed AI growing up out of the labs, demonstrating that it's mature enough to scale and solve a global educational problem. Hurrah. But, and of course, there's a few buts. It's complex technology. There wasn't really time for the kinds of informed discussion and perhaps procurement interrogation of vendors that might otherwise have happened under less rushed conditions. There were privacy protests at some institutions, and some institutions decided they weren't going to do this on those grounds. It turns out perhaps that some of the hype that always seems to surround AI wasn't such a shiny silver bullet as made out. And it turns out, interestingly, that remote proctoring is becoming business as usual, even when it's not necessary given the relaxed COVID conditions we have now. Although, of course, who knows when we're going to flip back into more extreme lockdown. So there has been time for research and reflection. And that's why we've got around the table today a fantastic group of people, some of the sharpest minds who are thinking about this from different angles. So I'm going to give each of them 30 seconds to give a quick intro so you can hear from them all. And then we'll start jumping into some of the issues. So kicking off with Jarrod.
Simon, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for everybody inviting me, and very honored to be speaking with everyone today. So my name is Jarrod Morgan. I'm actually in the United States in Birmingham, Alabama. I was working for a university back in 2008, and we had an online program where students were telling us they were struggling to find appropriate places to test. And so I created a system that we called ProctorU for our university use, and became pretty popular with the students. And so we became a separate company, and we've grown into a product and service that's now part of Measure Learning is the name of the company. And it is used all over the world by students that were choosing to go online, and then certainly a lot of folks during the pandemic. I'm actually, to be more official, I'm the founder, but I serve as our Chief Strategy Officer at Measure Learning.
Thanks, Jarrod. Jeannie.
Oh, hi. So I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that I'm the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands I'm living and working, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm at the University of Melbourne, and I'm the co-director for the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics. And we also experienced a number of our students who were being asked to participate in online exams and remote proctoring. So with my colleagues, Tim Miller, who's a computer scientist, and Simon Coughlin, who's an ethicist, we had a bit of a think about online proctoring and wrote a paper about the ethics of online proctoring, which is one of the fields of inquiry, I guess, that my centre's interested in.
Thanks, Jeannie. Yeah, and I commend that paper to you all. The link is in the event page. Lesley, going over to Western Australia.
Hi, I'd like to acknowledge the Noongar people, and I'm on Whadjuk country in Perth, Western Australia, at Curtin University. I am the academic integrity advisor at Curtin University, so I kind of help students and staff with academic integrity issues and do teaching and those types of things. But also in 2017, we saw, the writing on the wall that we were going to need some sort of remote proctoring solution for going forward. And so I developed with a few other colleagues an in-house solution. And so we've been building that. We've gone from in 2017 just using it in 5 units as a test to we've got probably 700 units with 22,000 or 200,000 sittings that happen, over the course of the year. So we've ramped up dramatically over the pandemic. So we've noticed a lot of different things happening, with the way that the students respond to that, and the problems with staff and the benefits. So we've learned a lot since 2017 about how students and staff respond to having that type of solution. And we think that there's a lot of flexibility is really the key in, using a system like this. And we can talk more about that later.
Excellent. Yeah, I look forward to hearing more about that. Last but not least, Phil.
Thanks, Simon. I'm Phil Dawson. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I am the Associate Director of the Centre for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University. I also wrote a book. It's sort of the end of 2019, the start of 2020, when the world was still kind of pretty normal. I wrote a book about cheating in online learning. It's called Defending Assessment Security in a Digital World. And that book became something that I've talked to a lot of people about as the pandemic went on. I have the unfortunate situation of being neither pro nor anti-proctoring, which I've found makes me really unpopular with lots of people. I think a lot of people want you to take some sort of fundamentalist side on this, and I think it's so much more nuanced than that.
Yes, it is. And what we're going to do now is explore some of those arguments. But as I said, this is no longer an abstract debate about, principles and arguments in the abstract. We're actually going to muddy the waters with some empirical evidence as well. Sorry about that, but we might actually consider what we are learning as a result of what's going on around the world now. As with every issue, there's a sort of mix of hype and hysteria, especially around tech. Hopefully we're going to challenge you if you've got some over rose tinted spectacles on about this. Hopefully we're going to challenge you if you've got some overly negative reactions to this at the moment, and stretch your thinking. So let's get into it. Kicking off then, look, exams aren't new. Invigilation's not new. We've just moved it online. So what's all the fuss about? We should just get on with it. Phil, could you kick us off by just giving us your initial thoughts about what this transition means and whether people are just getting, too uptight about the changes?
Yes, I mean, remote invigilation, remote proctoring, whatever, allowed us to do something pretty similar to an exam in times when we weren't able to do that normally. So it was, it enabled us some sort of continuity in modes of assessment, which for some people was a great thing. And then for some people was a missed opportunity to abandon the exam and go on to some other forms of assessment. I think something was lost in there in that, remote proctoring really was the thing that enabled online exams. To have an online exam that's got no proctoring or supervision, I would just say don't do an online exam, because the evidence seems to be that people are likely to cheat in a completely unproctored online exam. So remote proctoring enabled us to do online exams, and with that has come heaps of different affordances. You're no longer just stuck with pen and paper. You've got all the advantages of computers, software. I've seen instances where people have done remote proctoring and they've used the proctoring not to monitor for cheating primarily, but to track students' work processes and how they develop their work. So I think it's more complicated than just sort of continuity for exams.
Right. Yeah, and you talk in your book, which I really commend to everybody, thinking about the affordances of the new technology, what it makes possible to do, as opposed to just replicating good old-fashioned ways of engaging. Other thoughts about this transition?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll share kind of from the proctoring company's perspective. When I shared in my introduction in 2008, I was working at a small private college, and the problem that we were trying to change or trying to fix was our accreditors were telling us that if we were going to give assessments, they had to be proctored in some way. And we had students telling us, I have mobility issues, I have lifestyle issues, that the reason I'm learning online is because I can't physically go somewhere. And I need you to solve this for me. And so, the original premise 14 years ago or whatever for online proctoring was about increasing access. And what was really interesting was there was not a fundamental change in the way we operated in 2020, but there was a very fundamental shift in the conversation around what we did. And the primary difference, in my opinion, in 2020 was prior to that, we were an option that people were choosing. Whereas in 2020, for reasons that are obvious to everyone, if your school required you to have an invigilated exam, you didn't have a lot of options. You couldn't go physically to a place. And so the difference between telling somebody in 2019, hey, you can travel to your campus, drive, park, pay to park, walk 10 minutes, get in, check in your bag, do the whole thing, drive home, or you can take it on your couch at night, 24 hours a day. A lot of people chose the couch option. In 2020, that was no longer what was presented to people. It was, you have to use this. This is your only option. And I think students sort of totally expectedly had a reaction of, well, what is this thing you're telling me to do? And right. And a lot of these students were students that had never intended to learn online in the first place, right? But they were being made to do that because of the pandemic. And so that's kind of, from my perspective, the big shift in the conversation was the lack of an alternative. And for people that felt uncomfortable with it, they weren't given an alternative. And we don't really think that is how this should be done going forward.
Yeah, I'd like
I think that's, oh, sorry, you go, Lesley.
I was going to say, I wanted to add to what Jarrod was saying, that what we've seen over the last, the massive increase is that we find that some staff are using it for assessments that they shouldn't be using it for. So I think, because of the pandemic, it has, gone out to this big, and we need to kind of bring it back down to a much more contained, what it was more originally intended for. Like in my mind, it's intended for low stakes to medium stakes assessment. It shouldn't be for high stakes assessment. And it shouldn't be for things like mathematics, or for people that are maybe printing an assessment and having the student write it on a paper because they're trying to put mathematical formulas or graphing or something like that, that they're not able to do on, say a Word document, or typing something in, or an actual test that's online so you can see the screen. So I think that we need to consider what kind of assessments we're using this for.
So I think that's interesting. And I just think I wondered if it's worth making a distinction here between doing exams online and online proctoring. So we introduced it, I'm in the law school as well as in the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology. And in the law school, we actually introduced online examinations well before the pandemic. And that was actually a recognition of the fact that a lot of our students now don't write, actually, which is, I think, consistent with your point, Lesley. They do everything, they type everything. So to ask them to pick up pen and paper to write an exam was quite an awkward task for them. So we took a lot of our exams online, and students really liked that option. But to go to your point that you made earlier, Lesley, we actually took a couple of years to introduce students to that option. And to go to Jarrod's point, we gave them a lot of choice about whether they wanted to go online, type their exams, or do them in a pen and paper written form. But online exams are not the same as remote proctoring. Remote proctoring becomes a different part of the equation, because remote proctoring is the question of how you actually supervise the integrity of those exams, as opposed to what you do when you're doing online exams, which is basically lock students into a system where they can't access any other kinds of materials, but you have a person monitoring the exam in a traditional way, even if that may be virtual. And I think what we're talking about when we move to online proctoring is this combination of human and technological supervision of students. And I think part of the concern is, as Jarrod said, it wasn't introduced slowly. So students actually didn't understand how it was working. Certainly a lot of the protests where I am were that students simply didn't know what was happening. They didn't know who was supervising them, whether it was an AI or a person. And that's part of the concern. And then there's just a general opacity about what the the AI human element is. And I think some of it is perhaps the exam that shouldn't be used for high risk circumstances, but also there's this issue of just letting people know what's going on.
Right. So yeah, interesting points there. Online exams is different from proctoring. Interesting challenge around disciplines like maths that use a lot of equations and stuff that you might normally write as well. Those are technological affordance issues. But the proctoring, the invigilation, just so we're clear on what we mean by remote proctoring or invigilation, just so we all have some understanding of there's quite a few different ways of doing this. Jeannie, can you just clarify what some of the different options are, at least at Melbourne?
So it's actually quite hard to find out what the different options are. So, and I think the companies providing the services have become better at explaining what they're doing, and the universities have too. But remote or online proctoring can range from, well, it involves verifying the identity of the student, and then monitoring the behaviour of the student over the course of taking an exam, so that we know that the right student is taking the exam, because actually one form of cheating is actually to get someone else to take the exam for you. And then it's monitoring of the behaviour of the student over the course of the exam to make sure that they're not getting assistance from someone or something that they shouldn't. And the techniques for doing that vary. So in some instances, it's just a human sitting at the other end of the screen. So certainly at my institution, how we did online exams was to have students in small rooms like this and a person sitting there watching them. That's pretty labour intensive. So as a number of people have mentioned, universities went to commercial providers, which is effectively outsourcing exam supervision. And it may be that they're simply relying on the staff of the proctoring firm to do that observation of students, or they're using, the firm is providing technological or AI solutions. That might be facial recognition to verify the identity of the students, or it might be software that's trained to pick up cheating behaviours. So that might be unusual eye movements, unusual head movements, whispering, apparently consulting other sorts of resources. And then, as Simon mentioned, keeping an eye on what's in the room for students to use. I should add that most of these systems have a human in the loop at all times. So the AI is used to identify suspicious behaviour, which is then verified by a human. And then it's up to the university to decide what to do with that. And I think part of this conversation is working out who's responsible for what and the safeguards that are put around any systems that are in place and who's responsible for those.
Right. Yeah, all the human infrastructure that's needed to actually act should the system flag something. Jarrod, you're obviously providing these services. Do you want to add a bit more to just so everyone understands what the different options are?
Yeah, Jeannie did a good job of sort of diving into it and laying it out. I like to think of it in kind of two camps, right? So there was, when we first started it, we consulted some academics around us and we said, what has to be happening for an exam to be valid if I was watching it in person. So if someone was writing on pen and paper, and we've had this mantra ever since that of like, you're supposed to see the student, you're supposed to see what they're doing, and you're supposed to know who they are. And that's kind of what happens in the classroom and sort of how we've, broken out what we do online. There's really sort of two camps. It doesn't really matter what company you're talking about of technique. The one is to use a live person in real time that can interact with the student. And then the other is to use a various means of technology, some of what Jeannie was just talking about a moment ago, where a system will watch them and then someone will monitor or go see what the system has found or watch the entirety of the footage after the fact and then make a decision. The difference there being a live person at best will prevent cheating. So you can stop somebody in the act. And, if somebody starts to reach for something, you can say, hey, don't do that. And then you've kind of crisis averted. And in the other camp, the best you can do is catch cheating, right? And it sort of puts you in a few more situations where you got to kind of figure some things out. So it's the watch it live and the watch it recorded and watch it later. Those are really the two kind of broadly, the two kinds of techniques that people use for online invigilation.
Right. So I think because of the rush and the lack of understanding, that there were these, dystopic images of an AI deeming you to have cheated and you've failed, sort of thing, which of course was a little extreme. But this is what happens when stuff's rolled out quickly that we don't understand.
Yeah. Do you mind if I speak to that for a second, Simon? I mean, so Jeannie said another great thing that was, ideally there's a human in the loop somewhere, right? And what we have sort of found over the last couple of years is where this breaks down and where you see people get very uncomfortable when students feel like they're not sure if they're being treated fairly is when you're not sure where the human is in the loop. And so one of the you mentioned it earlier before we got started, Simon, we actually decided to sunset a product. And the reason was because our system would monitor a student while they're taking an exam. And then our system would look at statistically what exams probably may have had a problem. And then the faculty was supposed to go look and verify, and then it was up to them whether there was actually cheating going on or whether they broke the rules of the exam or whatever. What we found is when a faculty or a person at the university was asked to do that, it depends on the time you measure, but on average, about 10% of the time were those videos even opened one time. So you had these situations where the system was saying something might be a problem, and faculty or whoever it was that was being asked wasn't actually opening the video. Could have been they weren't trained to do so. Could have been, I mean, it's a lot of work to do that, and they weren't getting paid extra. I'm not sure it's a reasonable thing to ask a faculty member to do, but the net effect was you had people making snap judgments on something that AI had said and said, well, this is a problem, so you got to take your exam again, and students feeling like that, understandably feeling like that's not fair. So because we found that that was such a prevalent, we hadn't had that product very long, we sunsetted that product, and we will only use the record method if we have our people doing the review, because we can verify that it's being done by trained people and being done properly. It still allows the school to make the decision, but we don't want to have any products, and the statement that I've always made is it's not appropriate for AI to decide the fate of a student. That is a job for a trained person to do. And I think that's something that kind of everybody can get on board with. And so that's when people think that they have a lot of problems with it, there is an assumption that there's this programmed AI that's going to make a decision about you moving too fast or looking up while you're thinking, and you're going to flunk your exam. And that should never be the case, right? And if it is, then there's a breakdown in the way this is being applied.
Okay, very interesting.
I found that that thing of, a lot of the instances of AI flagged proctoring not being followed up. It was around 90%, wasn't it, of them that never did. And I think it's really easy to sort of forget the human work that's around all those processes and around following up instances of cheating. Rowena Harper and Tracy Brettag and some colleagues did some work on, why don't academics follow up instances of cheating? And I think sort of the top two reasons were it was perceived as too difficult to prove and too time consuming. And yeah, the AI thinks something has happened, I guess wasn't compelling enough to overcome that sort of perceived proof and workload barrier for people, perhaps.
This is a common problem with AI, actually. As soon as you use that word, and I don't think you actually use it very often in your promotion, Jarrod, so I'm not actually having a go at you, but I think once that word's used, it creates exactly the reaction that Simon and Phillip have talked about, that people are either, oh, well, that's fine, we can defer to the decision that's made by the technology, or there's an anxiety about the technology, and that might be felt by students, but it can also be felt by staff. And I think you're exactly right. The pandemic was really hard on university academics as well. They were all of a sudden being asked to do a whole lot of things that they hadn't been trained in. They were overworked and overburdened with trying to get on top of the technology, often taking up time that they weren't being paid for. So that idea that, oh, and now I've got another job, which is to scrutinise some video image of a student that's been identified by some technology, you can see why that there may be real hurdles to doing that. And that doesn't mean academics don't care about cheating. Of course they do, but academics themselves were often overworked and coping with difficult homework environments and the like. And that's the sort of hurdle of technology that in this case, it was plopped into institutions without a lot of grounding for either students or the staff who were supposed to be relying on it. And Lesley, your work is really interesting there, actually. On that
that what you're saying is really playing into the policy aspect of it, is that we really need to have good policies for staff to understand what is their responsibility. So we definitely had to think really hard about this, because we were finding similar things that, some staff just, it was too big to review. Like they have 2,000 students and they're just like, wait, this is way too hard. We can't review this as, a staff member. On top of marking the exams and that sort of stuff, then we're going to review all the recordings. That's just too much. So what we've found is that having clear policy directives, like who is responsible for this? The unit coordinator is responsible for ensuring that this is done and identity verification is done. And we also found that in our institution, because especially during the pandemic, when all the face-to-face exams were canceled and things like that, we had all these invigilators that were normally in the face-to-face venues. So we did a retrain of those staff members, and we had those staff members then reviewing our recordings. So they are trained invigilators. It helps the staff, so everybody benefits. They still have a job. They can, do the videos, review them, and then go back to the staff members that they were assigned to and say, these are the ones you need to look at. This is where we see something that's unusual. So I think that there's ways to think about this. And like I said before, flexibility really is the key. I don't think that there's a single solution that's going to work for everyone. I think there needs to be some flexibility in how we use these types of things. And, remote invigilation is not going to be appropriate for every assessment, and it's not going to be appropriate for every student, but for some situations and for some students, it's going to be beneficial.
Right. So really important points there. As we look back in the blinding wisdom of hindsight, who in their right mind would have thought that academics, with all that spare time they had during COVID, were going to sit through hundreds of hours of video or watching flagged video clips? It's complete nuts, right? But institutions made these procurement decisions, and there wasn't really time to think through the whole human infrastructure needed to make this stuff work. Now, I guess we're a little wiser. Lesley, you've just given a nice example. Well, we retrain and upskill the invigilation teams, or we buy that service from the service provider. They will have trained people who will watch the videos and only flag to us, right? I don't know if there are any other options, because the academics aren't going to put their hands up to do this, but perhaps folks in the audience have other suggestions about how they actually review the red flagged incidents. Okay, can we talk a bit about some of the ethical concerns that are arising now around this? How do we now think about this? What are the biggest ethical issues that an institution should be thinking about as they plan this?
Well, I'm going to jump in there. I think from the conversation we've had, for me, a couple of the big ethical issues here go to transparency, because one of the concerns we've had through this whole sort of move to technological process is that students in particular, and you started with this point, do not know how and in what form they're being monitored, and what is happening with the information that's gathered about them. So transparency is huge. And this is always, I think this is always a tension that we're seeing with the rollout with technologies, whether it's by governments or, commercial institutions or universities, that there's a whole lot of pressures not to explain what's happening, partly that because it's outsourced, so the information is held by private companies. There's a concern that if we tell students too much, they might game the situation. And I think sometimes the institutions that are perhaps rolling out the technologies, Lesley's aside, don't understand them enough to explain to students what is being done, how is the technology being used, and also what are the processes for contesting and appealing adverse outcomes of that technology. And then the other big one is, of course, privacy, because however much we like to say it, we may say that talk about students having the convenience of sitting exams in their own homes. But the flip side of that is that many students are being asked to be scrutinised or surveilled in what should be a space that is private to them. And, surveillance of students at that sort of very close proximity that comes with remote proctoring is a real change in how they relate to the university and how they experience the university.
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat from Jerry Maroulis about the feeling of being constantly watched really, really closely, right? Which is not the same as having an invigilator walking around the hall at a suitable distance. That does feel different.
Yeah, I would, I would say we kind of have to have a little mercy on everybody for the last 2 years. I mean, school administrators, faculty, students, everybody's been through a lot. We had to make a lot of change in a lot of things that nobody had planned for. And so, I think Jerry's comment is a valid comment, right? I mean, there are students that feel that way. I think that there are a lot of students that, when given a choice, would much prefer to take an exam in an environment that they're comfortable in, and where they've actually, if they're learning online, where they've gone through the rest of their course. I think the key is
I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can say that, because I actually wonder how much choice students have. And I mean, privacy is a really important value. And if you look at how students learn online, often they have their camera off. Then they haven't got their camera on. They've got it off because they don't like they actually do not like being watched by a screen in their home. So we talk about convenience, but I don't think we should confuse that with not minding being watched, or that convenience necessarily equates to choice. That would just be my comment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I just kind of get back to the point where I think it should be, remember, where the original reason that I started this years ago at a school was to give people choice and access. And like, I believe that at my core. This should be about, in 2023 and beyond, we should be building education programs that students, no matter where they are in their life, or their mobility situations, or their financial situations, or whatever it is, can weave this into their life. And we feel like online invigilation should be one of the tools that people are allowed to choose if they feel comfortable with it. If they don't feel comfortable with it, they should be given reasonable accommodations to do it a different way. The same way we make accommodations when people have a disability, right, that prevents them from being able to test effectively. So I would agree. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you guys are saying. There are people that feel that way, and if they feel that way, then we should make them. And it oftentimes it's not, something that we can solve at Measure Learning, but the school needs to make another way for them to test available.
Yeah, we've done quite a few interviews with students who have participated in online exams at our university as part of a research project. And I'd say all the views that we've put forward today are represented in our data, all of them. The students are such a diverse group of people. I've spoken to the, extreme online civil liberties type student, and then I've spoken to the student who really cares that other students aren't cheating in this online exam. And then I've spoken to a lot of students who wanted to wear their pajamas and not travel. And it's just such a diverse group of people. We're working on a book at the moment in our research centre around inclusion and assessment. And I just thought it'd be nice to weave in a little bit of thinking about inclusion here. Remote proctoring affects different students differently. For some students, it is a real plus. For some, it's a real negative. There are students with, overt declared disabilities who, through this, various bureaucratic systems we have, can get certain supports. And there are some students with, other needs that sometimes don't get those formal supports. So I think it's so diverse. A lens I'm trying to think about it through is validity. So validity being in assessment, because remote proctoring is all about assessment. Validity, in a simple form, is about assessing what we intend to assess, and not accidentally assessing a bunch of spurious other things that we don't really want to include. And I have some concerns about things like trait test anxiety. And there is some evidence that if you have trait test anxiety, you perform poorer in remote proctored exams versus your peers and stuff like that. That's an example of remote proctoring hurting validity. But if we view cheating as a threat to validity, because if you cheat, your assessor can't assess how capable you are because you've cheated, then remote proctoring can be viewed as a positive for validity. So it's like weighing up the harms to validity that we have and the helps to validity that we have.
Yeah, and perhaps we can, we're going to keep talking ethics all the way through this, right? But can we talk a bit about evidence and what we actually are learning as we have had time to study this? Lesley, you've done some really interesting work in your context. Can you give us a few of the headlines about what you've learned about the student experience of this, the quite a few questions in the chat there about the student experience as well.
Yeah, I think like Phil was saying that what we've found from surveying students and talking to them is that there is a range where you have the students that will never accept remote invigilation and remote proctoring because they feel like it's an invasion of their privacy, all the way to students that think it's great. It's because it gives them flexibility. So we do have that large spectrum. But what we found really is that the majority of students, it's about familiarity with the system. What we're finding is that the more times that they use it and the more they become comfortable with it and the more information that we give them about it. So the more information about the privacy. So we say we have a very specific amount of information. We've done a privacy impact assessment, through our legal team. We've got all of the different policies on how long their data is going to be stored, who's going to be looking at, who's responsible for it, all those. So the more information we can give the students to be informed, the more comfortable they become with it. And also having a situation where they can only use a system maybe one time for an exam, that's very high stress. So if you're going into a situation, you've never used the software before, and you're going in and having to take, an exam that's worth 50% of your mark and not really knowing that much about it, that's really stressful. So we found that familiarity is really the key. So if they have practice sessions where they're getting used to it, doing little assessments, getting used to the system all the way throughout, that's a huge jump in students' comfort with being able to use a system like that. So in our data, we found about 80% of students that they thought it was our system was effective for deterring cheating. So obviously, some students don't think it's effective at all. But I think that's similar to some of the other things. But I think one of the things that you do get from it is identity verification. So you can see who's taking the test, which is important. And in practice, we found that, during COVID, assessments were changed very quickly, and you ended up with some situations where staff were saying, okay, well, we're going to make this exam a take-home exam without invigilation. And we found that in those situations, cheating by programs such as Chegg, where they can, contact the website and get real-time help, just skyrocketed. We saw the cheating through Chegg just go up immensely. But we found that the staff members that used invigilation, there was no cheating using Chegg, because they couldn't, because the session was invigilated, so they couldn't call someone up and do those sorts of things. So, we have some evidence of effectiveness. Definitely, I think that some students, if they're determined to cheat, they're going to get around these systems. So it's really a deterrent in my mind, rather than, a cheating detection system. That's not really what it should be about in my mind.
If I could follow up on that, I can point to about a dozen published studies that to me show it is a deterrent, as Lesley says. So these are studies where students are perhaps randomized into taking either a proctored or an unproctored online exam, and the students in the proctored group tend to score lower than the students in the unproctored group. These studies mostly don't go into other potential explanations for it, but I'm willing to buy the idea that there probably is a deterrent effect against cheating. I can't point to a single study where it's shown that remote proctoring is effective at detecting cheating. And I do this rant, this is the abridged version, but if anyone perhaps works for a proctoring company who would be willing to let someone like me come in and try to cheat, and we see if you can cheat in remote proctoring, and then we publish a study about it, not a hit piece, just something to contribute to the literature about this. I would love to do that. I've approached many remote proctoring companies about this, and I've had some meetings and whatever, but none of them have actually agreed to do that. The argument for remote proctoring is the whole, if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. It's this idea that students should have transparency. And I'd love it if it sort of worked the other way, that the remote proctoring companies are open to us trying to cheat and then publishing about it. Because as Jerry says in the chat, there are a number of websites that tell students how to cheat in remote proctored exams. Staff are worried about this. Are those cheating approaches effective or not? So far, we just have to trust the proctoring companies, but I'd love to see peer-reviewed evidence.
Yeah, I mean, so I'd be happy to put some of these in the chat, but there have been at least 5 studies that I'm aware of since 2020 that have said just that. And particularly one from Radford University in the US that talked about the evidence and particularly how much it diluted the performance. I don't know that if you send a single person in, so for instance, if I took the same logic, if I sent a single person in to an on-campus exam and I had something written on my hand and the person giving the examination didn't see that, does that invalidate the validity of in-person exams because we got away with it one time or even 5 times?
Absolutely not.
Probably not.
I
right?
guess it's just we have a literature about that, and we know things about detection of cheating in the sort of face-to-face exams, but we don't on remote proctored exams.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do, and I would. By the way, we think you can't improve on what you don't measure, and so we're super. This was an interestingly timed webinar because 2 days ago we put out our first annual study on cheating data, and I'll drop the link to that in the chat for everyone that would like to take a look at it. Let me see if I can pull that off without blowing the. Yeah, I did. Okay. So what that study showed was that there was a 13x increase in cheating from pre to post pandemic. And what I mean by in cheating, let me be clear, that was what we call confirmed breach incidents. So that means that someone was seen doing something. A proctor said, this is clearly outside of the rules of the exam. It went to a second human being in our organization who independently came to the same conclusion. And then it was sent to a faculty member who agreed. And so the number that went to 1 out of 15 exams had a situation where multiple people came to the same conclusion. And that is the largest jump I've ever seen in that data since we've started tracking it. And if you don't, I think that is a fundamental thing that we have to talk about, because if you don't think that's important to consider, then I think and again, it's important to remember, these are people that clicked through an online proctoring process and should definitely know that they would be caught, right? And so it's an interesting jump in the data. Sorry, go ahead, Jeannie.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, it's good to see the data, and I keep coming back to the role of the university, Lesley's university aside, and actually explaining to students what's happening, because I think it's hard to say that students knew they were being proctored if students don't know what the proctoring process involves, and also the types of behaviours that will be caught and won't. And some anxiety around proctoring can also explain performance. But actually, what I wanted to go back to is we're talking a lot about cheating and the sort of trade-off between cheating and quite profound surveillance of students, which is an ethical matter, is problematic to normalise surveillance in institutes of higher education. I think that is problematic, has to be balanced against cheating. The other possibility here, instead of outsourcing, the taking and monitoring of exams, is actually to develop different techniques for examining. And we talked about mathematics and computer science. Those are areas where I think, at least in computer science, the take-up of remote proctoring has been quite low, but computer science faculties have developed other ways of setting exams that perhaps reduce the incidence of cheating. And certainly in my own faculty, we've thought about ways that you might examine students that produce meaningful outcomes that reduce the likelihood of cheating, but without involving, online exams, which are, in most instances, pretty poor ways of assessing students for the skills they're going to need when they go out into the world anyway. So I don't think this is the time to talk about alternative assessment methods, but I just wanted to drop in that another response to cheating is to use different means of examining students.
Yeah, that is a whole, I mean, the question of whether exams are an appropriate form of assessment is a huge issue. It's probably not one we can go into today, except to the extent that they demonstrate alternatives to proctoring. But before we just move off the question of evidence, are there any other examples of evidence that have been gathered now that are worth sharing with everybody, just to give them a sense of what we are now learning?
So I've got a couple of studies that I can drop in the chat as we move on, because I knew you were going to ask that question. So I don't want anybody to think I have these memorized, right? But by the way, I would agree with one of these studies shows the problematic issue of homework assistance websites and Chegg, and I think those are horrible organizations that have built a great business on enticing students to be dishonest. And I think it's a real problem in education, and kind of the antithesis of what we stand for, and that too. So I'll be happy to drop some of those in there, and you guys can kind of make up your own minds.
Also, I mean, I don't have a particular studies about the cheating, amounts of cheating, but we do catch people cheating with our system. It happens very regularly. And I think the students forget that they're being invigilated because they just do really dumb stuff. You know, they, in the middle of an exam, they pick up their phone or they text someone, or they use Facebook Messenger when, you know, their screen's being recorded. So it's those kinds of things that, you know, you can kind of think about it in a couple of ways, that they're blatant about it and they're just assuming that no one's going to be looking at the videos, or B, they are forgetting that they are being invigilated. So yeah, in practice, we definitely have a fair amount of cheating cases that come through us because of the remote invigilation a year.
And what do we know, if anything, in any kind of rigorous way, about how good the AI is, the different kinds of AI that are involved? Is there any published evidence out there that we can point to at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know that there is a lot of information on that. I mean, and you know, so I think it was Jeannie said this earlier, like the term AI is an interesting, you know, it insinuates that the I of AI is insinuating that technology is making a decision on its own, right? And that's certainly not how we use technology. We allow it, you know, to make a person more efficient in making decisions, but a person makes the decision. And I think at the end of the day, as you peel most techniques back on that, that's really what it drives down to. And so I think it's more important to, this is my opinion, right? It's more important to ask the question, how do we make sure that a person is making the decision every time, and then that person has been trained how to do it fairly? I think that's that question gets more to how it affects students than the tool that is going to be blinking at a human. And it's more important how they use it than what the tool is blinking about, I think.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as you know, a human-centered computing person, we're talking about the overall effectiveness of a human-machine system. And there are ways of designing rigorous evaluations of different configurations of human and machine. And it would be very, very good if, and this is one of the things that we try to promote in SOLAR, there was academically rigorous research working with leading vendors to try and establish that kind of evidence base.
I think that's such a good point, Simon, actually, and Jarrod, because of course what we suspect, but we haven't verified, is that there's a tendency for humans to defer to machines. So what we've seen in automated decision makings in government and say in banks or insurance companies is there's a human who's supposed to make the ultimate decision, but they defer to the machine. And there's a great report out from the New South Wales Ombudsman at the moment, which is talking about precisely this sort of issue about the human who is supposed to check the recommended decision but doesn't. And indeed, we started with that. So that field of inquiry around how the human person responds to the technology is so important, both from the perspective of the students. So that's also great work that Lesley and Phillip has done, but also for the academics that are using it. It's so important, those sort of little implicit biases that affect the way that technology is used. And I guess that's the point, isn't it? It's about the social technical system rather than one or the other.
Absolutely. And there is a rapidly growing field of human AI interaction, which studies how humans respond to prompts. And it's highly contextual as well. You've got very hard pressed staff who've got to make quick decisions. That's where machines can assist or, of course, subvert the process. Look, we need to wrap up in just a moment. So I'm just going to ask, has anybody got any final 30-second comments they'd like to make before we close this down? There's so much that could be said.
I guess I just want to say that most of the time, a remote proctored exam is probably not the right choice because there's all sorts of other assessment you could be doing. But my read of the evidence is if it really matters and you really need to do an exam, maybe do a remote proctored one. Just to put my cards on the table about my position. I'd be interested in other people's positions.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, I'll sort of leave just making my couple of points. Again, I think it's not appropriate to prescribe to students exactly how they should receive their education. You should allow them the choice to kind of make the decisions, and so we feel like online proctoring is an important part of that choice, but it shouldn't be the only choice, right? And that allows people to do that. And we think it's important for human beings to be making decisions about what happens to students. Technology can aid in making that more efficient and less error prone, but it's about humans making that decisions too. And those are the questions that as institutions that you guys should always be asking when you are if you decide to go down the path of using an online proctoring vendor or a technique. How do we ensure that a human is trained to make those decisions? And then, how do we make sure that students that are not comfortable with this have a reasonable alternative?
Thanks, Jarrod. Lesley, Jeannie, final thought?
My final, go Lesley, I've talked.
No, you go ahead, Jeannie. Oh, you're muted. Okay, I would agree with a lot of what, both Phil and Jarrod are saying. And I think that really clear policy, and if you are going to implement this at your institution, we have had to pull in all the areas of the institution to make this work. So we've had to retrain, the student-facing staff. There's a whole crew of people that they can call when they're having a problem. We've got tech people, we've got policy people, we've got exams invigilators. So we really had to do a massive amount of thinking about how this works for students. So really, the students are the ones, you got to come at it from their perspective. And so thinking about it from how best to, think about their comfort is really the best way to approach it.
Okay. Jenny, did you have a final thought?
Oh, I actually agree. I think that focus on the students is critical. Students are anxious and young, and they've got a lot of pressure on them. So really giving them time and space to walk through these technologies is important, particularly as the scope for their choices are a lot narrower than we might as university academics like to think. So I totally agree with the student-centered approach.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to thank you all extraordinarily for those insights. Hopefully that gives you some guidance and provocations to everybody about how you take this work forward. I'll pass back to Isabel for a few final closing words.
Thank you, Simon. First, a very big thank you also for the panel today. And of course, a big thank you for everyone joining us today. I think it was a really insightful discussion, and I hope this session keeps you inspired about these topics. We have a webinar every 2 months, so the next webinar is in June. We will announce more details soon in the Solar newsletter. So I'm just gonna post, like, if you're not registered in the newsletter, you can join throughout this link. So feel free to subscribe throughout the Solar website and to tell colleagues. So thanks again. Have a great, I don't know, evening, whatever, depending on your day or afternoon. And take care. Thank you again to everyone joining us and to our panel.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thank you.